It is customary to start a discourse with a prayer. And I don't feel really entitled to do that, but I would like to read you a poem. It's a poem by Akka Mahadevi, a Lingayat poet from Karnataka in the 12th century. Very leading figure, and hundreds of her poems have survived to the present day. Uh, in those poems, she addresses uh, her Lord, her universal Lord, which in the Lingayat movement, as I'm sure you all know, was Shiva. But she addresses him in a different way. Rather than addressing him as Lord Shiva, she addresses him as the Lord white as jasmine, and in all of her poems. So let me read you one to provide an entryway into our conversation. O swarm of bees, O mango tree, O moonlight, O coil bird, I beg of you all one favor. If you should see my lord anywhere, my lord white as jasmine, call out and show him to me. You know, it's such a wonderful expression of a deep and personal spiritual search. And it's set vividly in nature, and that nature is filled with plants and animals to whom Akka Mahadevi turns for help in her search. She is immersed in this world, in the world of her experience. And the question I want to raise with you this morning is, how does Akka Mahadevi get to have her experience of bees and mango trees and moonlight and the coil bird? How does she get to see the world in which she is immersed? How does she get to hear the world? And I will take the position that this happens for her and for all of us by way of two systems in our bodies. Our sensory cells respond to events in the material world around us, and they communicate their responses to the brain via electrical signals in nerve fibers. And then the brain takes in those signals and converts them into the images and sounds of our conscious experience. I will not touch on the question of the origin of consciousness. It all happens because we are conscious beings, but I will not touch on that. Modern science has no answer to this question. It's quite interesting that in recent years, many people have adopted a terminology that was introduced by David Chalmers, a philosopher originally from Australia and now working in New York. And he refers to the question of the origin of consciousness as the hard question. What I will be taking up is, in Chalmers' terminology, the easy question. What is the origin of the content of our consciousness, as opposed to the origin of consciousness itself? So let me introduce this easy question by reading you a passage from a book whose title is The Brain, the Story of You. Rather ambitious title, isn't it? The author is David Eagleman. He's a professor of neuroscience at Stanford and the creator of some totally amazing technologies. The breadth of his thinking is manifest in the titles of the 6 chapters that form this book. Those titles are Chapter 1, Who Am I? Chapter 2, What is Reality? Chapter 3, Who's in Control? Chapter 4, How Do I Decide? Chapter 5, Do I Need You? And Chapter 6, Who Will We Be? And the passage I want to read you is the opening of Chapter 2, What is Reality? And here are Eagleman's words. How does the biological wetware of the brain give rise to our experience? The sight of emerald green, the taste of cinnamon, the smell of wet soil. What if I told you that the world around you, with its rich colors and textures and sounds and scents, is an illusion, a show put on for you by your brain? If you could perceive reality as it really is, you would be shocked by its colorless, odorless, tasteless silence. Outside your brain, there is just energy and matter. Over millions of years of evolution, the human brain has become adept at turning this energy and matter into a rich sensory experience of being in the world. How? It's rather reminiscent of classical Indian philosophy, isn't it? We have sense organs that collect information about the world we live in, but our experience of that information is generated inside us, in our brains. And in that sense, it is an illusion. We can explore this concept through the sense that we are usually the most aware of, which is vision. And start with a really, really simple example. If you look around yourself during the day, you will see a world filled with colored objects, right? However, if you go walking at night and out of the range of bright streetlights, are the trees green the way they were during the day? How about the blue color of your car or the red plastic that's on the taillights if the light, assuming that the lights are on? If we pay attention, we will realize that the world of our conscious awareness is brightly colored during the day. The colors get increasingly subdued as it gets darker, and they essentially disappear during the night. How can the world that we experience be so different during the day and the night? And which version is real, right? Well, there's a very direct explanation of why the world, the day world and the night world look so different to us, and it has to do with the sensory cells in our eyes. We, like almost all vertebrates, have two types of visual cells. They're called rods and cones after their shapes. The cones come in three types. There are blue sensitive cones, green sensitive cones, and red sensitive cones. I mean, each type of cone is more sensitive wavelengths than to the other wavelengths in the visible spectrum. Rods also have a maximum sensitivity in the blue-green, but there's only one type of rod. The output cells of the retina send nerve fibers to the brain. And those output cells that get input from the cones maintain that original wavelength distinction and convey it to the brain. The fibers that transfer the responses of the rods convey no wavelength information because the rods themselves do not make any such discriminations. All the rods are the same. So the brain receives information about the world along two distinct visual pathways. One that includes wavelength information and one that does not. And now here's the second critical distinction. The rods are far, far, far more sensitive to light than the cones are. Right? So now we have our explanation. Why we see a colored world during the day and a shades of gray world at night. During the day, there is ample light to activate the cones. At night, the cones drop out because they are not sensitive enough to the dim light that remains available. The rods are amply sensitive, but they treat all the wavelengths in the same way. So when the world is bright, we live in a cone-dominated brightly colored world, and when the light is very dim, we live in a rod-dependent gray world. In between, we do experience colors, but the dimmer the light, the duller the colors appear to be. So the way we see the world is governed by the properties of our receptor cells. And, just kind of in the ultimate, if we don't have receptor cells for a particular aspect of the world, we don't sense it, right? Classic examples are things like radio waves and X-rays. They're electromagnetic radiation, just like light is. But are we aware of them? They're all around us. They're passing through us all the time. But we don't know it because we have no receptors for them. Now, going back to color, some people have deficiencies in their population of color sensing cells. And the most common problem is poor performance or complete absence of the red cones or the green cones. And this leads to red-green color blindness, and that's not a rare condition. And it's a reduced ability to distinguish among colors in the middle of the visible spectrum. So people who are red-green colorblind live in a reduced panoply of colors. The world is the same. It's just that our constructed experience of its coloration is different than usual. And one more step. Red-green color blindness has a genetic basis. In order for our bodies to develop red, green, and blue cones, we must inherit from our parents an appropriate array of genes. When a gene required for building a functioning red or green cone is deficient or lacking, our body fails to make the corresponding cell in the way it should be made. And our perception of the world is correspondingly altered. And so in this sense, the world of our experience is dependent not only on the functioning sense organs and brains that are in our bodies, but also on the genes that we inherit from our parents, and hence on DNA molecules. So if you were going to push the point, you could say, we have color vision because of parental DNA, right? And that would be a true statement. So we've seen then some evidence that the world of our experience is dependent on the properties of sensory cells. The other part of the neuroscientific approach to Chalmers' easy question, what is the origin of the content of our perceptual world, is, of course, the brain. So let's explore the role of the brain first through some clinical observations. The great neurologist, clinical neurologist, Oliver Sacks, wrote a whole series of books for the general public. You may have read some of them, in which he shared his experiences with patients who came to him or were brought to him by their families to see whether he could figure out why they were behaving in such unusual ways and potentially to find steps that would be helpful. The most famous of these books is called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And that's also the title of the first story. And let me read you the opening pages of this story. It's about Dr. P. Dr. P is a music teacher. And, in clinical stories, both patients and oftentimes physicians as well are just referred to by their initials for the sake of privacy. So Dr. P was a musician of distinction, Oliver Sacks says, and then he offers some words of a really engaging portrait. And then he speaks to Dr. P. What seems to be the matter? I asked him. Nothing that I know of, he replied with a smile. But people seem to think that there is something wrong with my eyes. But you don't recognize any visual problems? Not directly, but occasionally I make mistakes. Sacks then talks with Dr. P's wife, and he does some standard clinical tests. And then he says, it was while I was examining his reflexes, a trifle abnormal on the left side, that the first bizarre experience occurred. I had taken off his left shoe and scratched the sole of his foot with a key, a frivolous sounding but essential test of a reflex. And then, excusing myself to screw my ophthalmoscope together, I left him to put on the shoe himself. To my surprise, a minute later, he had not done this. Can I help? I asked. Help? Help whom? Help you put on your shoe. Ah, he said. I had forgotten the shoe. Adding sotto voce to the Italian term that means quiet voice. The shoe? The shoe? He seemed baffled. Your shoe, I repeated. Perhaps you'd put it on. He continued to look downwards, though not at the shoe, with an intense but misplaced concentration. Finally, his gaze settled on his foot. That is my shoe, yes? Did I mishear? Did he missee? My eyes, he explained, and put a hand to his foot. This is my shoe, no? No, it's not. That is your foot. There is your shoe. Ah, I thought that was my foot. I helped him on with his shoe to avoid further complication. Dr. P himself seemed untroubled, indifferent, maybe amused. His visual acuity was good. He had no difficulty seeing a pin on the floor, though sometimes he missed it if it was on the left. So now let me skip a few paragraphs and go to the end of the visit. Dr. P appeared to have decided that the examination was over and started to look around for his hat. He reached out his hand and he took hold of his wife's head, tried to lift it off, and put it on. He had apparently mistaken his wife for a hat. His wife looked as if she was used to such things. So this is not unique. There are many clinical stories like this. And they provide very strong evidence that we create the world of our own internal experience. In more recent years, it has been possible to associate the perceptual experience of the patients with the functioning of specific brain areas. So let's again explore some examples that relate to vision. There have been numerous and quite extensive studies that have identified areas in the brain that are specialized for the recognition of faces. And faces are very important to us. And these cells or the activity of these areas allows us to distinguish faces from other visual objects. There are half a dozen small patches of cortex that perform this function, and they're clustered on the underside of the temporal lobe, right? The lobe of the brain that's on the inside of the temple of the skull. And they're among other defined areas in the brain that perform other highly specific functions. Most of these mapping studies have been conducted using functional MRI. That's a technique that allows the investigator to see the location of brain regions that become extra active under the conditions of the experiment. So in this case, when the picture of a face is presented to the subject, certain areas reveal enhanced activity. The technique enables the locations of functional areas of the brain to be mapped, but it itself says nothing about how they work, right? So let me give you an example of a study that does. It was a striking study published around 5 years ago based on electrical recordings showing the impulse activities of single cells in one of these face recognition areas. Right? You first define the area for face recognition by functional MRI, and then you put electrodes into that particular area and see what the cells are doing. In this case, it turned out that these cells encode specific attributes of a face when the image is presented to the subject. The subject in this case was a monkey, and they do so in a highly quantitative way. Some cells encode the separation between the two eyes. Other cells encode the size of the eyes. Other cells encode the size of the iris. And more cells pay attention to the features of the nose and the mouth and the teeth, all the components of a face in a quantitative way. And they do so in such detail that recordings from a collection of just 200 or so cells out of a vast, vast number that are present in this area allow the investigator with the right computer program to recreate the photograph that the monkey was viewing as the recordings were being made without the experimenter ever having seen that photograph himself. There's that much information in the neural activity in the face recognition area. So this is the sensory side of the kind of the analytical side of the exploration. But when you think about it, it by itself doesn't give any evidence that these cells generate our experience. They have the information, but we need to go one more step to test whether they participate in creating our experience. Well, here is another recent case. A patient was being treated surgically for epilepsy. And an epileptic seizure originates in a specific location, and one way of preventing seizures from recurring if other methods haven't worked is to surgically excise that region. And this entails mapping the region as precisely as possible because you want to do minimal damage to the brain. And the patient was undergoing such mapping carried out by placing electrodes on the surface of the brain. That gives the most precise location information. The preliminary data, probably from functional MRIs, had indicated that the area that needed to be explored in detail was an area that also included one of those face recognition areas. So the experimenters asked the patient whether he would be willing for a neurologist to use the electrodes that were in any case being placed on the surface of his brain to record from cells, to instead pass a little stimulating current. And that current would disrupt the normal function of the cells around the tip of the electrode. Right? And by disrupting them, you could put in place a test of what the impact of normal and abnormal neural activity in one of these face recognition areas is on perception, because you would be talking with the patient as all this is being done. The patient didn't know anything about the design of the experiment. He was kind of a naive subject. And he simply sat with the neurologist and he looked at him and he responded to his questions. Simple questions like, did you see anything unusual? When the stimulating electrodes were silent, there was no current. All the patient said was, no, nothing. But when there was current passing, his answer was profoundly different. And here's one example. You just turned into somebody else, he said. Your face metamorphosed. Your nose got saggy and it went to the left. You almost looked like somebody I'd seen before, but somebody different. That was a trip. So the patient's perceptual experience of the neurologist's face was altered in a striking way by altering the function of cells in the face recognition area. So this is cause and effect. So I think that there is no doubt that the brain generates our perceptual experiences out of the sensory input that it receives. And David Eagleman and the Upanishads are exactly right. The world of our experience is an illusion in the sense that it is created within us, specifically within our brains. However, even though the world of our experience is internally generated and in that sense is illusory, it is absolutely not arbitrary. We have evolved in a way that allows us to survive in the external world. We have perceptual mechanisms that allow us to gather food, to protect our bodies from damage, to protect our offspring. I mean, we cradle our babies, right? For a reason, and so forth. So our illusory, in quotes, internal world has to be highly realistic and functionally effective in the ordinary physical world. Let me, as we approach the end, share with you a personal experience I had just last evening. I was at a wonderful gathering that had many qualities of a satsang. Part of the setting was a semicircle of half a dozen large candles. And at one point, I started musing about those candles and my experience of them in the framework that I have tried to convey this morning. I was able to see the flickering flames of those candles because electromagnetic waves with wavelengths in the yellow part of the visible spectrum came from the flames into my eyes. Now, that's what enabled me to see the flames. I saw the flames as yellow because my brain generated the sensation of yellow based on the electrical signals it had received from my retina. The electromagnetic waves were real. They had nothing to do with me. Had they not been there, I would not have seen a flame. My experience of the flames being yellow, however, and not some other color or colorless, that was generated by my brain. If I had brought my hand into the vicinity of the candles, I would have felt warmth, even at a distance. I would have felt it because the flame also generated waves in the infrared range, and those waves warmed up my skin. Temperature receptors in my skin signaled my brain, and my brain generated the sensation of warmth. Had I been careless and let my finger move into the flame, I would have yelped with pain because my real pain receptors, activated by real damage to my real tissue, would have sent a stream of real nerve impulses to my real brain. And on the basis of those impulses, my brain would have generated a subjective experience of pain. Yellowness, warmth, and pain are internal experiences. They are not inherent in the flames. My brain created those experiences. However, the electromagnetic radiation in the visible range and in the infrared range and the heat energy that could have burnt my skin were real features of the material world around me. So my internal experiences, self-created and in that sense illusory though they are, were causally tied to material reality. And now I want to conclude by going back to the beginning of my talk. What we have dealt with this morning is the easy problem, and the content of our conscious experience. In the process, we have addressed much of the content of Akka Mahadevi's wonderful poem. She wrote, "O swarm of bees, O mango tree, O moonlight, or coil bird, I beg of you all one favor. If you should see my lord anywhere, my lord white as jasmine, call out and show him to me. We have seen how it is that she could see the bees and the mango tree and the moonlight and the coil bird, and how it is that she could hear them if they literally called out to her. Akka Mahadevi was searching for truth in the form of the Lord white as jasmine, and she was seeking help in that search. Her eyes and ears and brain formed a gateway for connecting with the sources of that help that were all around her. Did they not, therefore, also play a role in the search itself? Thank you. Thank you for being with me and letting me explore this area with you. And we have ample time for a conversation.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Yes. Um, in spite of the illusion, I think there is an agreement between all of us, you and me and everybody here, that there is an objective world. There is internet and there are houses and cars and so on. So, um, so first of all, you do believe that now that may be scientific 3PP evidence that there is an objective world, but so in spite of our illusion, there is an objective world. So um, the related question is that apart from senses, is there any way for brain to communicate with outside?
Well, of course, many people have asked that question. And let me put it this way. I'm not persuaded that there is, but I have a very good friend by name of Marjorie Woolacott, who's also a neuroscientist and with whom I've shared a spiritual path for many decades, who has a different view. And she has actually established an organization in this country called the Association for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Science. And that's a very revealing title because post-materialist means she wants to contribute to the development of a science that is not constrained by what we understand today of the material world. But the fact that it's post-materialist science means that she wants to encourage work that explores this question in a scientific way, with the kind of rigor that we associate with science. So you may start with personal anecdotal experiences, but you don't stop there. You pursue and you try to find evidence for what is actually happening. Right. And there are certainly domains where people have invoked something non-material. To me, the evidence is not persuasive because I don't think the evidence that I'm aware of adequately excludes materialist explanations. It's very hard to do that, right? In science, you're forever faced with the challenge of alternative hypotheses. You have your own hypothesis, you have an observation, you say, oh, this happened because, and the first response of any reviewer of the paper you want to publish will be, have you considered alternative hypotheses? That's just part of the process. And I don't think these investigations have gone sufficiently far in that direction, but we don't know what will be true years from now. So she also has a hypothesis, which I found very intriguing, about why the brain is essential to the content and in fact to having of consciousness or having consciousness to begin with, even if consciousness is out there somewhere outside the body. Right? And she offers an image. She says the brain is like a radio. If you want to hear the concert that's being broadcast from the radio station, your radio has to be working. If it's not working, you won't hear anything, or you'll hear noise, right? So the mere fact that you require your brain to have these experiences does not preclude the possibility that the world, your conscious world is actually outside of you somewhere, and you are tuning into signals. I don't personally, I don't think there is data that requires this kind of explanation. But if you look only at a logical level, that is an alternative hypothesis that is very hard to rule out because the brain is necessary. So it's necessary if the brain generates the experiences, and it's also necessary if it tunes into the experiences.
But mechanism is hard to find. I will stop now. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Does this generate any responses?
I have a few things. One is, human perception is limited. Our frequency of sound, what we can hear is limited. Our, vision is limited. We can't see as good. And electromagnetic perception is limited, and magnetic perception is limited. I mean, we don't come to know that there is a tsunami coming, but the elephant knows it. Right? So it's like our brain is limited. So there are other, sensory possibilities which we can have, which will allow us to know more. But then there are people who can see far away, like telepathy and things like that, right? Who can know, but those exist, but we don't know. Like we can't prove it that it's true yet. But yeah, there are other possibilities which do exist.
Yeah, well, there are many examples of animals who have senses that we don't have. All right, anybody who has a dog knows very well that that dog has a sensory world that is dominated by olfaction in a way that far exceeds anything that we can do. And in fact, you can train dogs to detect clinically relevant smells and do things like remind their owner to take some insulin because they're diabetic and they haven't kept up with their shots, right? And they can do that by smell. So yes, we don't see ultraviolet, most of us, but honeybees do. And they go around and they actually see patterns on the petals of flowers that have evolved on the part of the flowers for the purpose of attracting the honeybees. And we have no idea. We can't see any of that. We can bring it into our experience because it turns out that the sensors in many video cameras are sensitive to UV. So if you look at the flower petals with the appropriate kind of video camera, then you can see the patterns that the honeybee sees, but otherwise we don't. And there's ultrasound. And there are electric fish that detect electrical fields that they generate, and they detect the distortions of those electrical fields by the relative conductivity of objects in the environment. So they maneuver in the dark in a river where we would be completely lost, and they do it by electrical fields, right? So it's absolutely true that there are many domains of the material world that we know exist that either other creatures can detect or we can detect using instruments that we have designed, but that are not available to our direct sensory perception. So yes, we experience a very narrow slice of what there is, and that is undoubted. What is less clear is what the boundaries are, because to get really unambiguous evidence of telepathic communication, people have been working on that for decades. Now, I used to subscribe to a journal that published papers devoted to exactly that kind of work. And in the matter of alternative hypotheses is always a challenge. The matter of reproducibility and so on. So my personal feeling about that is that that's an area that's well worth exploring. But the exploration becomes valuable when it is done very carefully. And that's why that association for the advancement of post-materialist science appeals to me, because that is one of its goals. One is to explore these sort of non-materialist experiences that people have reported for so many years, and the other is to do it in a rigorous way. And if they are successful, then over time we will be more secure in evaluating the experiences that people talk about.
Johnny,
Mm-hmm.
if it's okay for somebody who's not a part of your group to join this
Oh,
conversation.
of course. You are part of the group by definition.
I just want to observe. It's so interesting. This last. I'm so glad to see these gentlemen challenging you on these subjects and raising questions. But I want to point out that it seems to me, based on what you were just saying, that Akamahadevi seemed to be asking for that kind of communication from the world around her, a psychic communication. She wasn't expecting the trees, to yell out, but there was going to be, if God was present, there was going to be a communication that she would hear from the world, and perhaps no one else would hear because she'd asked for it and because she was tuning into it. All these things you're talking about. And it's so hard, as you say, to scientifically measure such a communication. But anyone who has ever received an inner message has a different relationship to this kind of question forever after. I don't know how they could ever be tested scientifically. I've never, I just don't see.
No, I don't either, but I have an alternative hypothesis.
Uh-huh.
Right? Which also is very hard to test. Okay. So you haven't, I mean, I've had experiences edging on that. And they are decidedly interior experiences. There are two ways of looking at that. One is that they are a message from some other entity. The other is that they are internally generated by you. And
Well,
how do you distinguish?
if we're all one, then perhaps there's no distinction.
Well, that is the direction in which I myself tend to go.
Yeah.
Right? And that's why the understanding that even having color vision is dependent on somebody else's DNA. Yeah, that goes in that direction because it means that the abilities and the attributes of my own body are tied to something else, something outside of me. In this case, the DNA of my parents. But where did that DNA come from? Right? So you go back in evolution, and where did the atoms that make up that DNA come from? Well, they go to exploding stars, and you're out in the universe in just a few steps. So if you step back and paint the big picture, I think you could absolutely say that one's internal experience is a manifestation of the history and properties of the entire universe. And that would fit with modern science.
Mm.
And if you go that far, then distinguishing that from basically ill-defined ideas of what a universal divinity is like, that becomes very hazy, and I, again, speaking in a personal way, I resonate with descriptions of an ultimate divine like Brahman or Shiva that recognize that we don't know what to say about that,
Mhm.
right? And I do not resonate with descriptions that give very specific attributes, especially if those attributes are very human-like. Right? Then, there's that old saying, God didn't create us, we created God. And there's something to that. So if the version of the divine that draws you is one that you're not really able to describe, you just have a sense, you have a belief that there is something underlying that of which we are a manifestation. Then the difference between that and saying that we have the properties we do because of how the universe evolved, they get very close, I would say.
Well, when I think about these things, I think about the way I see it is that my work as an individual entity is to try to expand my heart and my consciousness so that I can truly identify in that way with all, however it all came to be.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly the way I feel. This is why I go out into nature every day.
Mm.
Johnny,
Yes, please.
enjoyed your presentation, which was a brain teaser, to say the least. Thank you. Well, the thing is, I'm just reflecting in my own mind as I'm expressing a few words, whatever come from my heart. Hakama Devi, a Karnataka Lingayat lady, was singing a beautiful song, I said, instead of poem, in a sense of happiness and ecstasy. And she was expressing and identifying entities which were just as ecstatic as she observed. When she's talking about a jasmine flower in full bloom, which is bright white with a central, sometimes redness, giving out the magnificent bouquet that mesmerizes us all. The koel bird, the cuckoo that she's talking about, singing sweet songs which makes us excited and happy with happiness, because koel itself is happy because there is various flowers which are blossoming around during that particular season. The honey bees in their excitement and happiness to find out the sweetness from wonderful flowers which are blooming in the garden. So they were in a state of ecstasy as she was.
Mm-hmm.
And she was trying to find out the Lord. In reality, she was not finding the Lord. She had found the Lord. And she was identifying other entities from the same state of excitement, enchantment, ecstasy, if you will. And she was challenging us who were listening to her through her poem. And so you need to go and find that state of happiness for yourself. And the way I look at it is, as we human beings, being a radiologist myself, you're talking about function MRI is my field. What you're talking about is we tend to accept the world around us when we are awake as the real world. When we sleep through the stages of dream state, deep sleep state, and awake state. We understand during the dream state where the mind is working at a subconscious state. When you are deep sleep, you are connected with your inner true nature, the consciousness, except there's a covering of ignorance for human beings not knowing who you really are. And of course, when we are awake, we tend to evaluate the entities as our so-called bright mind identifies them, getting away from the true consciousness altogether. Because being separated from you as awake person, the objects that you identify, touch, and experience, and again, far away from your true nature, which is the consciousness, deep down, only experienced during deep sleep. So through continuous studies, personally, through communicating with the people with similar minds, thoughts, ideas, questions, and confusions, we need to go back within ourselves to find out who we are. Because inherently, as we've been always discussing over the last several years amongst friends, that we indeed are happy beings. Only things we do not know it. Only certain period of time in our life when we are alone with yourself, you find that moment of ecstasy where you're able to reject, throw away, discard all the external coverings that we think are the ones which are giving us happiness. And that comes through a deep state of meditation. At that time, all the external stimuli, the fetters, subjects that we consider as important are discarded. And you're connecting yourself within. And as we have discussed umpteen number of times during these sessions, we are only three entities within. We are awake, that means we exist. We are able to express, that means we shine. And if you throw away the external confusing, distracting, painful entities, we are internally happy. So basically, when you are in deep state of meditation within, what you have done is connected within yourself. And that inner entity itself, Johnny, is true happiness. And I think that's the time Akamadevi is singing, connecting within herself in that ecstasy. She's identifying other entities in the nature, which is just as ecstatic as she observed them. So thank you again for a brilliant presentation this morning. I want your comments too.
You know, I resonate with everything you said, but I note that there is an assumption that you make, and that is that, now maybe I'm reading it into what you said, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but you talk about a true self that has the attribute of joy and happiness. As long as that refers to an internal state, then I totally agree.
Mm-hmm.
If it also implies something like an Atman that is identical with something external and universal, at that point, I say that is a working hypothesis. But as long as you are talking about an internal state, I couldn't agree more.
That's what exactly I'm referring to. Because in reality, the so-called God that everybody calls is no different than who you are. So what I'm saying is, that's the Atman I'm talking about. That's inner happiness.
Okay.
And everything that I see around with my eyes within of happiness, I see nothing but happiness. The colors, glasses you're talking about, seeing the cones of red, blue, and green in your eyes, allowing you to see different colors. That's how you are able to see the world. So you're able to find out Satchit Atman, Ananda, with 3 different kinds of codes. You'll be able to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think we have to remember that the world is not exclusively joyful, right? I read just the other day, there was an account of written by a physician who had gone to Palestine to work in a hospital.
Right.
He was Palestinian himself, but he was living in England. So he was basically went home to treat people, Palestinians who had been injured in the war. And he described one case after another, many of them children, many of their bodies shattered by explosions. That is also part of the real world. So he had an internal state that allowed him to be a good physician under these horrible circumstances. That's saying a lot. Many people would have been totally put into a jumbled state and been unable to function well. He wasn't. He was internally very strong. But what he encountered was an environment that pointed to anything but joy. If he brought joy to it, that was because of his own amazing internal strength. But the reality out there is a mixed one. And it includes moments like Akka Mahadevi described, and includes other moments as well.
I hear you are saying, but I want you to reflect on one thing before we go to different aspects of the discussion today. You've been alive in this world for more than 75 years. I'm 84 years old myself.
Oh, well, so am I. We should shake hands.
Like 1939 is my model.
Yeah, that's right.
Good.
Which month?
October 15th.
Okay, I'm July 29th.
Yeah, the thing
I'm
is a good
months older than you are.
that year is a good vintage year, you know. So what I'm saying is if we recognize a dream that we all of us dream, and during the dream we are able to see several things which are exciting, happy, joyful, pleasant. At the same time, we see sometimes painful, hurtful, unhappy entities in the dream too.
Mhm. Mhm.
If you are able to project your mind even further and see that this entire universe itself is a projection of your own mind. And what you're talking about, even in Palestine, I know what you're talking about. When you are dreaming, Johnny, you're hurting yourself too. Because during that dream, you yourself are at pain, grief, because you're not able to tolerate that discomfort and grief. During that dream state, you are so much at agony because of the thing that you see. But when you are recognizing that this world that we consider as real, if you understand that it's really a Maya Nagari,
thank you so much.
city of Maya, then it will be less discomforting for all of us to accept that we live as we are. I'm going to stop right there. I'm sorry about it.
Yeah, let me share just one little item from my own history.
Please do.
I was raised in the Christian church. I was raised as a Lutheran, and when you're a Christian, you typically go through something called the confirmation process. when you're reaching the end of elementary school, it's typical age, and you're taught a whole bunch of stuff about your particular denomination, and then you get a blessing and you're confirmed. Well, when this was happening to me, it generated total rebellion. And I didn't want to have anything to do with the kind of religion that I was being taught. That was the end of high school.
Mhm.
Then I had the privilege of going to a rather remarkable high school. That was the end of elementary school. Then I went to high school, and that high school was quite amazing. I was only able to go because they gave me a scholarship. And it was a tiny school. Our graduating class was 27. And it ran from the second grade to the end of high school. Among the teachers were a couple of Quakers, and they invited me to come to Quaker meeting for worship.
Mhm.
And I was absolutely amazed because in the Quaker meeting for worship, there is no minister, there is no sermon, there's no singing, there are no decorations, there's no ritual. All that happens is that when the time comes, everybody who's present sits down on a chair. Typically, the chairs are arranged in a circle. Everybody goes quiet and listens for the voice inside. That is the whole point. And that's the meaning for worship, is listening for the voice inside.
Mhm.
When I had that experience, that reopened the entire doorway to the possibilities of a spiritual life. Was listening to the inside. And there's no dogma about where that voice comes from.
Makes a lot of sense. I enjoyed it. Thank you.